Hello, my friend, and welcome. Tonight, settle into something soft and warm, dim the lights if you can, and let your shoulders drop just a little. We are going to travel together slowly, gently, through a long and winding story, the story of Vietnam, and of a war that shaped the second half of the 20th century. There is no need to remember every date or every name. Just let the words wash over you like a tide going out, and if you drift off before we finish, that is exactly as it should be. We will still be here, chapter by chapter, whenever you return. This is a long story, so we will take it slowly, night by night, chapter by chapter, never rushing. Tonight we begin at the very beginning, long before helicopters and jungles and nightly news broadcasts, in a smaller, quieter Vietnam, shaped by rivers and rice and centuries of memory. Chapter 1. A Land Between Rivers. Close your eyes for a moment, my friend, and picture a long, slender stretch of land curling along the edge of the South China Sea, shaped a little like the letter S, green and humid, and threaded through with two great rivers, the Red River in the north and the Mekong in the south. This is Vietnam, a country that existed in one form or another for thousands of years before the war that made its name known around the world. The Vietnamese people have always told stories about their own beginnings, soft old legends passed down the way a lullaby is passed down, from grandmother to grandchild, over and over, softened at the edges with each telling. One such legend speaks of El Letter 1Ea1C Long Quan, a dragon lord of the sea, and Ao Ko, a mountain fairy. They fell in love, the story goes, and Ao Ko laid 100 eggs, from which 100 children were born. In time, the dragon lord and the fairy found they could not stay together. One belonged to the water, one to the mountains, and so they parted, each taking 50 of their children. Those who went with their mother into the highlands and those who went with their father toward the sea became, in legend, the ancestors of the Vietnamese people. It is a gentle story, a way of saying, we come from both water and mountain, from two directions at once, and perhaps that is why Vietnam's history is so often a story of pull and tension, of north and south, of two halves reaching toward each other and away again. Long before any war we would recognize, Vietnam's history was already old. By the time of the Bronze Age, communities along the Red River Delta were growing wet rice in flooded paddies, a way of farming that would define Vietnamese life for thousands of years afterward. The Dong Son culture, which flourished more than 2,000 years ago, left behind beautiful bronze drums, wide and heavy, decorated with images of birds, boats, and warriors, drums that were beaten at festivals and perhaps at times of war, their low bronze tone rolling out over the rice fields like distant thunder. You can still see some of these drums in museums today, quiet now, but once they called whole villages together. Then came 1,000 years of a different kind of story, the long shadow of China. In 111 BCE, the armies of the Han dynasty conquered the kingdom then called Nam Vi Letter 1EC7T, and for roughly the next 1,000 years, in waves and with interruptions, Vietnam existed under Chinese rule or Chinese influence. This millennium mattered enormously, my friend, because it shaped the Vietnamese character in a very particular way. Chinese administrators brought with them their writing system, their Confucian ideas about family, hierarchy, and duty, and their models of imperial bureaucracy. Much of what we might call traditional Vietnamese culture, reverence for ancestors, respect for scholars, a deeply ordered sense of family obligation, has roots that reach back into this long era of Chinese contact. But alongside this influence ran an equally powerful and equally old thread: resistance. Vietnamese history remembers, again and again, the moments when local leaders rose against Chinese occupation, even when those uprisings failed. In the year 40 of the Common Era, two sisters, Trung Tr Letter 1EAFC and Trung Nh Letter 1ECB, daughters of a local lord, raised an army and drove Chinese forces out of the Red River Delta for a brief, shining moment, ruling as queens before Chinese forces returned and crushed the rebellion 3 years later. The Trung sisters did not, in the end, win. But they are remembered still, in temples and in school books, as the first great symbol of a very old Vietnamese instinct. However small, however overmatched, resist the foreign power on your land. In the 3rd century, a young woman named Tri letter 1EC7UTH letter 1ECB Trin, still a teenager by some accounts, was said to have led another uprising, reportedly declaring that she would rather ride the winds and waves and slay the whales of the sea than bend her back to be a concubine to any man. Whether every detail of that story is precisely true hardly matters, my friend. What matters is that Vietnam kept telling it, generation after generation, as a kind of promise to itself. Finally, in 938 CE, a Vietnamese lord named Ngo Quy letter 1EC1N1, a decisive victory over a Chinese fleet at the B letter 1EA1CH D letter 1EB1NG River, using a now famous tactic. He had his men plant sharpened, iron-tipped stakes beneath the river's surface at low tide, then lured the Chinese ships into the shallows as the tide fell, impaling and trapping the enemy fleet. It was clever, it was patient, and it worked. And after nearly 1,000 years, Vietnam finally secured its independence from Chinese imperial rule. Do you feel it already, my friend, that quiet undertone that will run through this entire story? A relatively small country, sitting beside a much larger power, again and again finding ways, sometimes through patience, sometimes through cunning, sometimes through simple stubborn endurance to remain itself. You can rest on that thought a while if you like. We are not in any hurry tonight. Over the centuries that followed independence, Vietnamese dynasties rose and fell in turn: the Lai, the TR letter 1EA7N, the Lair, the Nguy letter 1EC5N, each building temples, digging canals, writing laws, and occasionally fighting off further invasions, including, remarkably, several attempts by the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, which Vietnam also managed to repel. In part using that same trick at the B letter 1EA1CH D letter 1EB1NG River, stakes in the water, patience in the plan. Vietnamese territory gradually expanded southward too, in a long, slow push sometimes called the Nam Thi letter 1EBFN, or southward advance, as Vietnamese settlers moved down the coast, absorbing the Cam kingdoms and eventually reaching the rich, watery delta of the Mekong in the far south, the region that would later become so important in the war we are moving toward. By the 1800s, Vietnam was a single, if often internally divided, Confucian kingdom under the Nguy letter 1EC5N dynasty, with its capital at HU letter 1EBF, a graceful city on the Perfume River, full of walled palaces, incense, and ceremony. It was a country that thought of itself, quite reasonably, as an old and coherent civilization, heir to thousands of years of memory. It had no idea, of course, what the sea would soon bring. And this is where we will rest for tonight, my friend. Sleep now, if sleep is calling you, and know that when we return, we will step onto the decks of French ships approaching the Vietnamese coast, and watch as an entirely new and much darker chapter begins to open. Rivers, dragons, drums, and stubborn queens carry those images gently into your dreams. Good night, and I will see you again soon, chapter by chapter, for as long as this long story takes to tell. Chapter 2, Ships on the Horizon. Welcome back, my friend. Get comfortable again, let your breathing slow, and let us pick the thread back up right where we left it, on the calm green coastline of an old and confident Vietnamese kingdom, unaware of the ships already crossing the sea toward it. European sailors and missionaries had been visiting Vietnam's shores for centuries before any real conflict began, drifting in on trade winds, trading silk and spices, and in the case of missionaries, quietly building small communities of Vietnamese Catholic converts. A French Jesuit named Alexander de Rhodes, in the early 1600s, helped develop a way of writing Vietnamese using the Latin alphabet instead of Chinese-derived characters, adding gentle little accent marks to capture the language's musical tones. That writing system, called Q, U letter 1ED1C NG letter 1EF, eventually became the standard way of writing Vietnamese, and it is what those Vietnamese names in our story tonight are written in. It is strange to think, my friend, that something so useful and lasting could come from a relationship that would later turn so bitter. For a long while, contact between Vietnam and the West stayed relatively small, a trickle of traders and priests. But the 1800s were a restless century for European empires, and France, in particular, was hungry for colonies to rival those of Britain, and eager for new markets, new resources, and new prestige. French missionaries were, from time to time, persecuted or executed by Vietnamese emperors who saw Catholicism as a foreign threat to Confucian order, and France used these incidents, real as some of them were, as a pretext for something much larger than protecting missionaries. In 1858, French warships, together with a Spanish contingent, opened fire on the port city of Da Nang, and the slow, grinding conquest of Vietnam by France began in earnest. It did not happen all at once, my friend. It crept forward over decades, treaty by unequal treaty, province by province. Saigon fell to French forces in 1859. By 1862, the Vietnamese court was forced to cede 3 southern provinces to France outright, the beginning of what the French would call Cochinchina. French gunboats, superior in firepower and technology, could sail up rivers and shell fortifications that Vietnamese defenders, brave as they were, simply could not match with older weapons and traditional tactics. Over the following 2 decades, France extended its grip further, eventually dividing Vietnam into 3 administrative regions under French control: Cochinchina in the south, ruled directly as a colony, and Annam and Tonkin in the center and north, technically protectorates that left the Nguy letter 1EC5 and emperor on his throne in HU letter 1EBF, but stripped of any genuine power. Along with Cambodia and later Laos, these territories were bound together into what France called French Indochina. Imagine it, my friend, the strange, hollow feeling of that arrangement. An emperor still sitting in his palace, still dressed in imperial silk, still receiving ceremonial bows, while real decisions were made by French governors and administrators in offices nearby. It was rule by appearance over one, and rule by force underneath. The French colonial project reshaped Vietnamese life in ways both large and small. Rice production in the Mekong Delta was pushed to serve export markets rather than local needs, and many Vietnamese peasants became tenant farmers or laborers on land increasingly owned by French colonists or a small class of Vietnamese landlords aligned with them. Rubber plantations were carved out of the countryside, worked under brutal conditions by Vietnamese laborers, many of whom died from disease, exhaustion, and mistreatment. Heavy taxes were imposed, including, notoriously, taxes on salt, alcohol, and opium, with the colonial government itself controlling and profiting from opium sales, a bitter irony for a colonizing power that liked to describe its presence as a civilizing mission. And yet, alongside the roads, railways, and grand colonial buildings France built, alongside the genuine introduction of some Western education and infrastructure, there ran, again, that same old undertone we noticed back in Chapter 1. Resistance never fully stopped. Scholar gentry in the countryside organized uprisings in the decades after conquest, movements with names like the C-1EA7N Vuong, or Aid the King movement, which fought in the name of a young emperor who had fled the French-controlled court. These early uprisings were, in military terms, mostly unsuccessful, put down by superior French firepower, but they kept alive a current of organized opposition that would later feed into something far larger and far better organized. By the early 20th century, a new generation of Vietnamese nationalists began to look past old-fashioned loyalty to the emperor and toward newer political ideas entirely, ideas drifting in from Japan, from China, from Europe itself. Nationalism, republicanism, and eventually, communism. Among the young Vietnamese who left their homeland in these years to see the wider world, working as a ship's cook, a photo retoucher, a pastry assistant in London and Paris, watching, reading, absorbing radical ideas in cafes and meeting halls, was a slender young man who at various times in his life used many different names, but who is remembered by history mostly by the name he took later, H-letter 183 Chai Min. We will meet him properly very soon, my friend. For now, just hold his outline gently in your mind, a quiet young traveler taking notes, waiting. Rest now if you're drifting, my friend. French gunboats, silk-robed emperors stripped of power, rubber plantations in the mist, a young man abroad taking mental notes on revolution. Let these images settle like sediment at the bottom of a river. When we continue, we will watch the First World War end, new ideas sweep across Asia, and the seeds of Vietnamese communism take root. Good night for now and rest well. We have a long, long way still to go, and we will go there slowly together, chapter by chapter. Chapter 3. A World at War and a Man Named Nguy letter 1EC5N. Hello again, my friend. Settle back down into the quiet. Tonight we watch the wider world catch fire, and we watch how that fire, far away in Europe and the Pacific, changed everything in Vietnam. Let us go back a little first, gently, to that young traveler we glimpsed at the end of the last chapter. He was born in 1890 in a village in central Vietnam, given the name Nguy letter 1EC5 and Sin Kung, though he would take many names over the course of his long life, a habit common among revolutionaries who needed to slip past colonial police. As a young man, he left Vietnam on a French steamship, working as a galley hand, and over the following years he drifted through many of the world's great port cities, New York, London, and finally Paris, absorbing odd jobs and even odder political educations. In Paris after the First World War, when the victorious powers gathered at Versailles to redraw the map of the world and talk grandly of self-determination for nations, this young Vietnamese man, going by the name Nguy letter 1EC5 and IQU letter 1ED1C, meaning Nguy letter 1EC5 and the Patriot, rented a suit and tried to deliver a petition asking for basic rights and representation for the Vietnamese people under French rule. He was, of course, turned away, not even granted an audience. It is such a small, quiet moment, my friend, easy to miss in the grand sweep of history, and yet it tells you almost everything about the coming century. Colonized peoples asking politely for dignity, and being politely, firmly ignored by the very powers who had just fought a war supposedly for freedom and self-determination. That rejection pushed him further left. He read the work of Lenin, he helped found the French Communist Party, and eventually in the 1920s, he traveled to Moscow for training, and to southern China, where he gathered young Vietnamese exiles together and began building the beginnings of an organized revolutionary movement. By 1930, meeting with various Vietnamese communist factions in Hong Kong, he helped unify them into what became the Indochinese Communist Party. He would later, during the Second World War, adopt the name history remembers him by, H-letter 1ED3 Chai Min, meaning roughly, he who enlightens. Picture him now, my friend, thin, patient, endlessly disciplined, moving between safe houses and mountain hideouts, a man who had spent decades of his life waiting for exactly the kind of crack in the world that was about to appear. That crack came with the Second World War. In 1940, France itself fell swiftly to Nazi Germany, and the French colonial government in Indochina, now answering to the collaborationist Vichy regime, found itself in an impossible position when Japan, expanding its empire across Asia, demanded access to Indochina's resources and military bases. Rather than fight, French colonial authorities largely capitulated, allowing Japanese troops to occupy Indochina while, strangely, leaving French administrators nominally in charge of day-to-day governance for several more years, a peculiar arrangement of two occupying powers layered atop one another, both extracting what they could from the Vietnamese population. Japan demanded enormous quantities of rice and other resources to feed its war machine, even as local food production was disrupted by flooding and by farmers being forced to switch fields from rice to industrial crops like jute. The result, in the winter of 1944 into 1945, was a catastrophic famine in northern Vietnam, one of the great, quiet horrors of the Second World War, in which historians estimate that somewhere between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese people starved to death, even as rice was being shipped out of the country and sat stockpiled in warehouses. Let that sit with you for just a moment, my friend, heavy as it is. An entire population starving amid plenty, because of decisions made by distant powers who saw Vietnam only as a resource to be extracted, not a place where people actually lived and hoped and worried about their children's next meal. It was into this atmosphere of suffering, humiliation, and colonial collapse that H. Letter 1ED3 Chi Minh returned to Vietnam in 1941, after 3 decades abroad, crossing quietly back over the border from China into a limestone cave in the northern province of Cao B. Letter 1EB1NG. There, alongside younger revolutionaries who would become central figures in the decades ahead, including a former history teacher named Vo Nguyen Giap, he helped found the VI Letter 1EC7T Nam D-stroke Letter 1ED9C, L Letter 1EADP D-stroke Letter 1ED3NG Min, H Letter 1ED9I, the League for the Independence of Vietnam, almost always shortened to VI Letter 1EC7T Min. The VI Letter 1EC7T Min was, from the start, a communist-led organization, but it was deliberately framed to the broader public as a nationalist coalition, an umbrella for anyone who wanted Vietnamese independence, regardless of their politics, and this broad framing helped it attract support far beyond convinced communists, from peasants, students, and patriotic citizens who mostly just wanted foreign occupiers gone. The VI Letter 1EC7T Min spent the early 1940s building guerrilla bases in the mountainous north, training small armed units, and notably, cooperating quietly with American intelligence operatives from the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime precursor to the CIA, who saw the VI Letter 1EC7T Min as a useful ally against Japan. American agents even helped train and supply VI Letter 1EC7T Min fighters in 1945, and H Letter 1ED3 Chi Minh, ever the careful reader of the world's mood, made a point of quoting the American Declaration of Independence when the moment came for him to speak to his own people. Isn't that a strange, almost dreamlike detail to carry into sleep tonight, my friend? The very same words that inspired the founding of the United States, echoed back sincerely by a Vietnamese revolutionary hoping, for a moment, that America might actually support Vietnamese independence. In March 1945, sensing the tide of the war turning and worried about Allied landings, Japan finally moved to remove the pretense of French rule entirely, staging a swift coup against French colonial authorities and installing a nominally independent Vietnamese government under Emperor B Letter 1EA3 O D-stroke Letter 1EA1I, the last NGUY Letter 1EC5 and Emperor, though real power still rested with Japanese military authorities. This arrangement lasted only a few months. In August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered, and suddenly, across Vietnam, there was a genuine power vacuum, French authority shattered, Japanese authority collapsing, and no one yet firmly in charge. The VI Letter 1EC7T Min moved fast. In what became known as the August Revolution, VI Letter 1EC7T Min cadres and sympathizers seized government buildings, arsenals, and administrative offices across the country, often meeting little or no resistance, since there was barely any functioning authority left to resist them. On the 2nd of September 1945, in front of a large crowd gathered in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi, H letter 1ED3 Chi Minh stood and read aloud the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He began, unmistakably, by borrowing the cadence of another declaration, saying that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Overhead that day, by some accounts, American aircraft even flew past in a gesture some in the crowd took, hopefully, as a sign of support. It must have felt, for one bright afternoon, like the end of the story rather than merely the end of a chapter. Of course, my friend, we both know it was not the end. It was, in truth, hardly even the middle. Let your eyes close now if they haven't already. Hold in your mind that square in Hanoi, the crowd, the borrowed words of an American declaration spoken in Vietnamese, the fragile, hopeful feeling of a single free afternoon. When we return, we'll see how quickly that hope collided with the returning ambitions of European empire, and how a first, terrible war for Vietnam began before the world had even finished cleaning up from the last one. Sleep well, my friend. We continue soon, chapter by chapter, patiently, the way this whole long story deserves. Chapter 4, The First War Returns. Welcome back, my friend. Breathe in slowly, breathe out, and let's return to Vietnam in the last months of 1945, where that one bright afternoon in Ba Dinh Square was already beginning to fade. France, humiliated by its defeat and occupation during the Second World War, was not prepared to simply let go of its colonial possessions in Asia. French leaders, including the newly restored government under Charles de Gaulle, viewed the return of Indochina as essential to restoring French pride and status as a great power. Under an agreement among the Allied powers, British forces arrived in southern Vietnam in September 1945 to accept the Japanese surrender, and rather than supporting Vietnamese independence, British commanders quietly allowed French troops to rearm and reassert control over Saigon and the south. In the north, meanwhile, Chinese nationalist troops arrived to oversee the Japanese surrender there, and while their presence was chaotic and often predatory, it also, for a time, gave H letter 1ED3 Chi Minh's fledgling government some breathing room, since China had little appetite for restoring French colonial rule outright. H letter 1ED3 Chi Minh, ever pragmatic, spent the following months trying to negotiate a peaceful path, at one point even reaching a preliminary agreement with France in early 1946 that would have allowed Vietnam to exist as a free state within a French-led federation, a messy compromise that satisfied almost no one. He is said to have remarked, with a certain rueful wisdom, that it was better to sniff French dung for a while than eat China's for the rest of one's life, a blunt way of saying that between two imperfect and dangerous neighbors, he judged France, for now, the lesser threat to Vietnamese sovereignty. But negotiations broke down again and again, undermined by hardliners on both sides, French colonial officials in Vietnam who had no real intention of allowing genuine independence, and Vietnamese factions who felt any compromise with France was a betrayal. The breaking point came in November and December of 1946. French naval forces, in a dispute over customs control in the northern port city of Haiphong, shelled the Vietnamese quarters of the city, killing, by various estimates, anywhere from hundreds to several thousand Vietnamese civilians. Weeks later, on the 19th of December 1946, after French forces in Hanoi issued an ultimatum demanding VI letter 1EC7 T Minh forces disarm, fighting broke out in the capital itself, and H letter 1ED3 Chi Minh's government, along with its small army, withdrew into the mountains to begin a long guerrilla war. This was the true beginning of what we now call the First Indochina War, a war that would grind on for nearly 8 years. It was, in many ways, a rehearsal for everything that would come later, my friend, and it is worth sitting with for a while, even sleepily, because so much of what followed traces directly back to these years. The VI letter 1EC7 T Minh, under the patient political leadership of H-1ED3 Chai Min, and the increasingly formidable military leadership of Vo Nguyen Giap, that former history teacher we met briefly in the last chapter, adopted a strategy that leaned heavily on the classic playbook of revolutionary guerrilla warfare, much of it drawn from Chinese communist theory. Build support in the countryside first, avoid direct confrontation with a stronger enemy until the moment is right, wear the enemy down through ambush, sabotage, and political organizing, and only fight large, set-piece battles once you can actually win them. Giap, remarkably, had no formal military academy training at all. He was self-taught, a voracious reader of military history, and he proved to be one of the most capable commanders of the 20th century, willing to accept enormous casualties among his own troops in pursuit of strategic goals, a grim trait that would characterize Vietnamese communist military leadership throughout every phase of the coming decades. France, for its part, tried multiple approaches. It attempted to build a rival Vietnamese government under former Emperor B. Letter 1EA3 O D-Letter 1EA1I, hoping that a nominally independent, non-communist Vietnamese state, called the State of Vietnam, might peel away nationalist support from the VI Letter 1EC7 Min. This effort had only limited success, since B Letter 1EA3 O D-Letter 1EA1I's government was widely seen, not unfairly, as a French puppet with little genuine sovereignty. Meanwhile, the war became increasingly entangled with the wider currents of the emerging Cold War. In 1949, Communist forces under Mao Zedong won the Chinese Civil War, and a communist government now sat directly on Vietnam's northern border, ready and willing to supply the VI Letter 1EC7 Min with weapons, training, and safe havens. The United States, increasingly alarmed by the spread of communism in Asia following the fall of China and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, began providing significant financial and military aid to France's war effort. Even though President Franklin Roosevelt had once been personally sympathetic to Vietnamese independence and skeptical of French colonialism. By the early 1950s, the United States was quietly funding a substantial share of the entire French war effort in Indochina, a detail that would prove enormously important once the war became, unmistakably, an American one. The fighting itself moved back and forth for years, French forces generally controlling cities, roads, and the Red River Delta, VI Letter 1EC7 Min forces controlling much of the countryside and the mountainous border regions, launching ambushes and slowly, patiently expanding their zones of control. It was a war of attrition, exhausting for France both militarily and financially, and increasingly unpopular back home, where it became known with weary irony as the Dirty War. And then, my friend, came DI Letter 1EC7 N Bien PH Letter 1E7. In late 1953, French military commanders, hopping to lure VI Letter 1EC7 Min forces into a decisive conventional battle, they believed France could win with superior firepower and air support, established a heavily fortified base in a remote valley in the far northwest of Vietnam, near the border with Laos, a place called I Letter 1EC7 N Bien PH Letter 1E7. The French plan assumed that the surrounding hills were too rugged and remote for the VI Letter 1EC7 Min to bring heavy artillery within range. It was a serious miscalculation. Giap organized an almost unimaginable logistical effort, having tens of thousands of porters, many of them ordinary peasants, disassemble heavy artillery pieces and carry them, piece by piece, sometimes using modified bicycles reinforced to carry loads of hundreds of pounds, up narrow jungle trails and steep hillsides overlooking the French positions, all done at night to avoid French aerial reconnaissance. When Giap's forces opened fire in March 1954, French commanders were stunned to find their supposedly impregnable valley base surrounded and bombarded from the high ground on every side. The siege lasted 56 grueling days. French positions were overrun one by one. Resupply by parachute became increasingly difficult and costly as Vi-1EC-7T Min anti-aircraft guns, also hauled up into the hills, took a terrible toll on French transport planes. On the 7th of May, 1954, the remaining French garrison surrendered. It was a stunning, historic defeat, the first time a European colonial power had been decisively defeated in open battle by an anti-colonial independence movement in Asia, and it effectively ended France's colonial war in Indochina. Public opinion in France, already exhausted by years of costly, inconclusive fighting, would not tolerate continuing the war after such a blow. Diplomats were, in fact, already gathering in Geneva, Switzerland, even as the battle raged, to discuss a broader settlement for both Korea and Indochina. In the wake of DI Letter 1EC7 and BRNPH Letter 1E7, the Geneva Conference produced, in July 1954, a set of agreements intended to end the fighting. Vietnam, the accords decided, would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, a line of latitude cutting across the narrow waist of the country, with VI Letter 1EC-7T Min forces regrouping to the north and French-aligned forces to the south. This division was explicitly meant to be temporary, a practical arrangement to separate the armies, with nationwide elections to be held within 2 years, in 1956, to reunify the country under a single government chosen by the Vietnamese people themselves. Those elections, my friend, as you may already sense, would never actually happen, but we will save that particular disappointment for our next chapter. For now, rest here in this strange, suspended moment. A war finally over, a country awkwardly split in two along a temporary line, hundreds of thousands of people uprooting themselves and moving, Catholics and anti-communists heading south, communist sympathizers and cadres heading north, all of them believing, or at least hoping, that reunification was only 2 years away. Let that uneasy, hopeful pause settle over you like a thin blanket. Sleep now if you need to. When we return, we will meet a new American ally in Saigon. Watch the 17th parallel harden from a temporary line into something far more permanent, and understand exactly why those promised elections never came. Good night, my friend. Chapter by chapter, we go on. Chapter 5, a line that would not fade. Hello again, my friend. Come back under the covers with me, and let's look at what grew up on either side of that thin, supposedly temporary line at the 17th parallel. The North, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by H Letter 1ED3 Chi Minh and the Vietnamese Workers' Party, set about consolidating a communist state, with land reform campaigns that, especially between 1953 and 1956, turned violent and chaotic, as local tribunals, under pressure to meet quotas of identified landlords and reactionaries, sometimes condemned innocent people, including loyal VI Letter 1EC-7T Min supporters, to imprisonment or execution. Thousands died in this campaign, a grim and rarely discussed corner of the story, and the excesses became severe enough that the party itself, remarkably, publicly acknowledged errors and issued corrections in 1956, an unusual moment of open self-criticism for a communist government. Even amid this turmoil, the Northern government worked steadily to build a disciplined party apparatus, a planned economy modeled loosely on Soviet and Chinese lines, and crucially, a military establishment that had just proven, at DI Letter 1EC7 and BRNPH Letter 1E7, that it could out-organize and outfight a major Western power. In the South, meanwhile, a very different kind of leader was rising to power, a devout Catholic nationalist and former imperial official named Ngo Dinh Di Letter 1EC7M. Di Letter 1EC7M had spent years partly in exile, including time in the United States, where he cultivated relationships with American political and religious figures who saw him as a promising anti-communist alternative to both the French-aligned B letter 1EA3, OD stroke letter 1EA1I, and the communists in the north. With American backing, DI letter 1EC7M became Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam in 1954, and in a controversial 1955 referendum, one widely believed to have been rigged, with DI letter 1EC7M reportedly receiving well over 90% of the vote in a contest that included implausible results such as more votes cast in Saigon than there were registered voters. He deposed B letter 1EA3 OD stroke letter 1EA1I and declared the founding of the Republic of Vietnam, with himself as president and its capital in Saigon. Once in power, DI letter 1EC7M, along with his government, refused to participate in the nationwide reunification elections that the Geneva Accords had called for in 1956. His stated reasoning was that his government had never signed the Geneva Accords in the first place, and that genuinely free elections were impossible in a totalitarian North where dissent was suppressed. The United States, which shared DI letter 1EC7M's fear that H letter 1ED3 Chi Minh would win any nationwide vote by an overwhelming margin, quietly supported this refusal, even though it directly contradicted the spirit of the settlement that had ended the First Indochina War. President Eisenhower himself later wrote that, had elections been held, as much as 80% of the population might well have voted for H letter 1ED3 Chi Minh over any alternative the South could offer. And so, my friend, that line at the 17th parallel, meant to be a temporary pause between armies, quietly hardened, year by year, into what amounted to a permanent border between two rival Vietnamese states. DI letter 1EC7M's government in its early years achieved some genuine successes, stabilizing a chaotic, refugee-strained South that had absorbed roughly 1 million people fleeing the communist North. Many of them Catholics respond to church calls and rumors that the Virgin Mary has gone south. But DI letter 1EC7M increasingly governed in an authoritarian, nepotistic way, relying heavily on family members, particularly his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, who ran a secretive, often brutal internal security apparatus, and Nhu's wife, Madame Nhu, who effectively served as the country's outspoken First Lady, since DI letter 1EC7M himself never married. DI letter 1EC7M's government cracked down harshly on former VI letter 1EC7 Thi Minh members and suspected communist sympathizers remaining in the South, through campaigns that swept up, alongside genuine communist operatives, many ordinary critics, land reform advocates, and religious minorities. He also favored the country's Catholic minority in government appointments, land distribution, and business licensing, in a country where the majority of the population practiced Buddhism, sowing resentments that would explode dramatically a few years later. Meanwhile, in the North, party leaders watched the failure of reunification elections with growing frustration, and by the late 1950s, they authorized a shift in strategy, from patient political work to renewed armed struggle in the South. Former VI letter 1EC7 Thi Minh cadres who had remained in the South after 1954, along with a new generation of recruits, began reorganizing into armed cells, harassing DI letter 1EC7M's local officials, assassinating village chiefs seen as particularly abusive or effective, and rebuilding the old guerrilla networks. In 1959, the North formally approved the use of armed struggle and began infiltrating personnel and supplies southward along an increasingly elaborate network of jungle and mountain trails through Laos and Cambodia that would soon become world famous, the H letter 1ED3 Chi Minh Trail. In December 1960, Southern revolutionaries formally established the National Liberation Front, often called the NLF, or, by its opponents more dismissively, the Viet Cong, a broad political front, much like the old VI letter 1EC7T Min, uniting communists and non-communist nationalists alike under the shared goal of overthrowing DI letter 1EC7M and reunifying Vietnam. Sit with that shape for a moment before you drift further, my friend, because it will define the rest of this story. A northern communist state, increasingly confident and well-organized, an unpopular and authoritarian but American-backed southern government and a homegrown southern insurgency, secretly directed and supplied from the north, fighting in villages, rice paddies, and jungle hamlets across the south. The United States, watching all of this from Washington, was becoming steadily more entangled, sending money, weapons, and, in growing numbers, military advisors, telling itself, at every step, that just a little more support would be enough to save DI letter 1EC7M's government and stop what officials called the spread of communism through Southeast Asia like a row of falling dominoes. Rest now if you're ready, my friend. A hardening border, a repressive government backed by a distant superpower, a hidden insurgency taking root village by village, and a jungle trail beginning to wind its way south through the mountains. When we return, we'll watch American advisors become American soldiers, and we'll sit for a while with the extraordinary events of 1963, a year that would end terribly for both DI letter 1EC7M and for an American president watching from far away. Good night for now. Chapter by chapter, we continue. Chapter 6, the year everything tipped. Hello again, my friend. Sink back into the pillow and let's ease into 1963, a year so heavy with consequence that it deserves its own quiet chapter all to itself. By the early 1960s, Ngo Dinh Di letter 1EC7M's government in Saigon was under strain from every direction. The insurgency in the countryside, now guided by the National Liberation Front, was growing steadily bolder, ambushing government patrols and expanding its control over rural hamlets, even as DI letter 1EC7M's government, with American encouragement and funding, tried to counter it through programs like the Strategic Hamlet Program, which forcibly relocated peasants into fortified, government-controlled villages meant to separate the population from the guerrillas. In practice, the program was deeply resented, uprooting families from ancestral land and burial grounds, and it often did little more than provide the NLF with fresh grievances to recruit around. Then, in May 1963, in the old imperial city of HU letter 1EBF, on a day meant to celebrate the birthday of the Buddha, government forces fired on a crowd of Buddhists who had gathered to protest a ban on displaying religious flags, a ban that Catholic groups had not been made to follow for their own religious displays just days earlier. Several people, including children, were killed. The incident detonated long-simmering Buddhist resentment over DI letter 1EC7M's favoritism toward the Catholic minority, and protests spread rapidly across South Vietnam cities throughout the summer of 1963. On the 11th of June, 1963, an elderly Buddhist monk named Thich Qu letter 1EA3 NG D stroke letter 1E9C sat down in the lotus position at a busy Saigon intersection, was doused in gasoline by fellow monks, and calmly set himself on fire, remaining perfectly still and silent as the flames consumed him, in an act of protest against religious persecution. A photograph of that moment, taken by an American journalist named Malcolm Brown, went around the world and became one of the defining images of the entire 20th century, a burning man sitting in perfect, terrible stillness. President Kennedy reportedly said, upon seeing the photograph, that no news picture in history had generated so much emotion around the world. Rather than responding with reform, however, DI letter 1EC7M's brother NHU ordered brutal raids on Buddhist pagodas across the country in August 1963, further inflaming both domestic and international outrage. By this point, senior officials in Washington had quietly concluded that DI Letter 1EC7M had become more of a liability than an asset, unable to unify the country or effectively prosecute the war against the insurgency, and too resistant to American advice on reform. Through back channels, American officials signaled to a group of South Vietnamese generals that the United States would not object to a change in leadership. On the 1st of November 1963, those generals launched a coup, seizing key installations across Saigon. DI Letter 1EC7M and NHU fled the presidential palace and took refuge in a Catholic church in the Kalon district, but were captured the following day, and, contrary to assurances of safe exile, were executed inside an armored personnel carrier while being transported into custody. It was a brutal, almost anticlimactic end for the man who had, just a few years earlier, been celebrated in Washington as the miracle leader who would save Vietnam from communism. And then, my friend, just 3 weeks later, on the 22nd of November 1963, President John F. Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The sudden, overlapping deaths of both leaders left Vietnam policy in the hands of a new American president, Lyndon B. Johnson, at precisely the moment when South Vietnam's political situation was disintegrating into a chaotic series of coups and counter-coups, with one military government replacing another in rapid, destabilizing succession over the following 2 years. Johnson, a domestically focused politician eager to build what he called the Great Society at home, nonetheless felt he could not be the president who lost Vietnam to communism, haunted by the political fallout Democrats had suffered a decade earlier over the loss of China. He inherited, almost against his own preference, an escalating commitment that he now felt he had no choice but to deepen. The final trigger for full-scale American war came in August 1964, in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. American destroyers conducting intelligence patrols reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, an initial engagement on the 2nd of August that did occur, and a second reported attack on the 4th of August that, according to later historical and even official government review, almost certainly never actually happened, likely a case of confused radar readings and jumpy sonar operators in stormy seas at night. Nonetheless, the Johnson administration presented both incidents to Congress as unprovoked attacks demanding a decisive response. On the 7th of August, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution by an overwhelming margin, granting the president sweeping authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It would become the legal foundation for the entire massive escalation that followed. Can you feel it, my friend, that sense of dominoes finally beginning to fall in earnest, amongst silent, burning protest, a president's brutal execution, another president's assassination in a Dallas motorcade, a disputed naval incident in a stormy Gulf, each one small enough on its own that history could have turned differently at any point. Together, they opened the door to full-scale American war. Rest here for a while, my friend, in the strange, tangled weight of 1963 and 1964. When we return, we'll watch American combat troops finally wade ashore on Vietnamese beaches, and the war truly become the one the world remembers. Sleep now. We'll go on again soon, chapter by chapter. Chapter 7, America Wades Ashore. Hello again, my friend. Let's drift back into the story now, into the early months of 1965, when advice and funding finally gave way to boots in the sand. By the start of 1965, the National Liberation Front controlled large stretches of the South Vietnamese countryside, and the South Vietnamese army, weakened by years of political chaos and coup after coup in Saigon, seemed increasingly unable to hold the line on its own. American military planners warned Washington that, without a much larger direct American role, the government in Saigon might collapse within months. In February 1965, after an NLF attack on a U.S. military installation at Pleiku killed several American service members, President Johnson authorized a sustained campaign of bombing against North Vietnam, a campaign that would run for over 3 years under the name Operation Rolling Thunder, intended to pressure Hanoi into abandoning its support for the Southern insurgency and to bolster sagging morale in Saigon. And then, on the 8th of March, 1965, the first American combat troops, roughly 3,500 Marines, waded ashore on the beaches near Da Nang, greeted, somewhat surreally, not by gunfire but by young Vietnamese women who had been sent by local officials to drape leis of flowers around their necks, and by a hand-painted sign reading "Welcome, Gallant Marines." It was a strange, almost gentle beginning to what would become the most searing chapter of the entire war for the United States. Those Marines had officially been sent only to guard the American airbase at Da Nang, a defensive mission. Within months, that mission quietly, steadily expanded as American commanders argued convincingly to Washington that a purely defensive posture made little sense against an enemy who could simply choose when and where to attack. General William Westmoreland, the American commander in Vietnam, adopted a strategy built around what became known as search and destroy operations. Use America's overwhelming advantages in mobility, provided by an enormous new fleet of helicopters, and firepower provided by artillery and airstrikes, to locate concentrations of enemy forces in the countryside, engage them in direct battle, and inflict such heavy casualties that the North would eventually be forced to give up the fight. Success in this strategy was measured, infamously, by body count, the number of enemy dead reported after each operation, a metric that would prove deeply corrosive over time, encouraging inflated reports, and in some tragic cases, a dangerous carelessness about civilian casualties, since a dead body in a free fire zone was too often simply counted as an enemy killed, regardless of who that person had actually been. Troop numbers rose with startling speed. From those first 3,500 Marines in March 1965, American troop levels climbed to roughly 200,000 by the end of that year, and would eventually peak at over 500,000 American service members in Vietnam by 1968 and 1969. Young men arrived by the plane load, many of them draftees, disproportionately drawn, as critics at the time and historians since have noted, from working class and minority communities, since deferments for college enrollment and certain occupations allowed wealthier and better connected young Americans to avoid conscription far more easily. The landscape they found themselves fighting in was almost impossibly difficult, my friend, and it is worth picturing clearly, even now, even sleepily. Dense, humid jungle where visibility might be reduced to a few feet. Rice paddies that had to be crossed on foot, exposed and slow-moving, under a punishing tropical sun. An enemy who rarely wore a uniform, who might be a farmer by day and a guerrilla fighter by night, who built elaborate tunnel networks, some running for many miles underground, complete with hospitals, kitchens, and sleeping quarters, allowing fighters to disappear entirely from sight after an ambush. Booby traps, pungy stake pits, and mines took a steady, grinding toll, less dramatic than large battles but relentlessly wearing on morale. American soldiers often described a deep, disorienting frustration, overwhelming firepower and technology, yet no clear front line, no city to capture that would end the war, no way to simply tell on any given day whether progress was actually being made. Meanwhile, the North pursued its own patient calculus. Party leaders in Hanoi understood that they could not match American firepower in direct confrontation, but they gambled, correctly as it turned out, that they could outlast American political will, since the North's population was prepared, after decades of continuous warfare against Japan, France, and now the United States, to absorb losses that would eventually become unacceptable to an American public watching a war, for the first time in history. broadcast nightly into their living rooms in vivid color and sound. Rest here for a moment, my friend, with the flowers draped over young Marines' necks on that first beach landing, with the helicopters thudding low over green jungle canopy, with the tunnels hiding an invisible enemy just beneath the ground American soldiers were walking on. When we return, we'll spend some time with the ordinary experience of the war itself, the villages, the helicopters, the long nights on patrol, before turning to the year that broke American confidence in the war entirely, 1968. Sleep well. Chapter by chapter, we continue on. Chapter 8, Life Inside the War. Hello again, my friend. Let's slow all the way down tonight and simply sit inside the texture of daily life during the war, on every side of it, before we move forward into the harder turning points. For the young American soldier, life in Vietnam was usually measured in a single, ever-present number. The days remaining on a one-year tour of duty, tracked on so-called short-timer calendars, sometimes elaborate hand-drawn illustrations divided into, say, 365 little squares, colored in one by one. Much of the war, contrary to the image of constant firefights, consisted of long stretches of tedium, patrols through heat and rain that produced no contact with the enemy at all, punctuated by sudden, terrifying bursts of violence, an ambush from tree line, a sniper's single shot, a mine triggered by a careless step. Soldiers carried heavy packs through mud and elephant grass that could cut skin like paper, endured monsoon rains that never seemed to end, and fought a persistent, exhausting enemy that was, more often than not, simply invisible. Helicopters became the defining machine of the entire war. The thudding rhythm of rotor blades a sound so constant that many veterans say it is the sound that still returns to them, decades later, whenever a helicopter passes overhead in ordinary civilian life. Helicopters carried soldiers into landing zones for search and destroy missions, medevaced the wounded within what became known as the Golden Hour, dramatically improving survival rates compared to earlier wars, and allowed commanders a degree of tactical mobility no army had ever possessed before. Yet this mobility could not, in the end, substitute for controlling actual territory, since American forces would sweep through a village or valley, declare it cleared, and then depart, only for NLF forces to quietly reoccupy the same ground within days or weeks. For Vietnamese villagers caught between both sides, daily life during these years was an unrelenting balancing act of survival. A family might be asked to shelter National Liberation Front fighters at night, on pain of severe punishment for refusing, then be searched, questioned, or worse by South Vietnamese and American forces during the day, suspected of exactly that same sheltering. Free fire zones, areas designated as presumed enemy territory where anyone remaining was assumed hostile, forced many peasant families to abandon ancestral land, farms their families had worked for generations, and crowd into refugee camps or urban slums around Saigon and other cities, disrupting a way of life built around rice cultivation and village community that had held steady for centuries. Chemical defoliants, most infamously Agent Orange, were sprayed across millions of acres of jungle and farmland to strip away the forest cover the guerrillas relied on, a program that succeeded in denying cover to the enemy but also devastated ecosystems, and as later became painfully clear, caused severe and lasting health consequences, including cancers and birth defects, for both Vietnamese civilians and American service members exposed to it. For National Liberation Front and North Vietnamese fighters, life was, in its own way, just as grueling, though shaped by different pressures. Many spent months moving supplies and reinforcements south along the H-1ED3 Chi Minh Trail, an increasingly vast network of paths, river crossings, and hidden depots winding through the mountains and jungles of Laos and Cambodia, deliberately routed outside Vietnam's own borders to complicate American bombing efforts. though American aircraft bombed those neighboring countries relentlessly regardless, expanding the war, quietly and with limited public disclosure at the time, into 2 additional nations. Fighters along the trail faced malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion as much as they faced bombs, walking for months at a time, carrying supplies by bicycle or on foot through terrain that made vehicle transport nearly impossible in many stretches. Political education remained a constant feature of life for NLF and North Vietnamese soldiers, regular sessions reinforcing belief in the justice of their cause and the inevitability of eventual victory, a form of morale maintenance that many veterans and historians alike credit with helping Northern and NLF forces endure losses that would have broken the will of almost any other army in history. Back home in the United States, meanwhile, this was the first war brought nightly into American living rooms through television, an intimacy with combat that no previous generation of civilians had ever experienced. Photographs and film footage of burning villages, wounded children, and flag-draped coffins arriving home began, gradually at first and then with gathering speed, to erode the confidence many Americans had placed in their government's assurances that the war was being won and that the end was in sight. Rest here a while, my friend, in all these overlapping, exhausting textures of survival. The short timer calendar, the thudding helicopter blades, the hidden jungle trail, the family caught impossibly between 2 armies. When we return, we will arrive at the last night of January in 1968, the eve of the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, and a surprise so large it would change the entire course of the war, even though militarily it very nearly failed. Sleep now. We continue soon, chapter by chapter. Chapter 9, The Lunar New Year. Hello again, my friend. Let's ease into the last days of January 1968, quietly, the way the war itself crept up on almost everyone that winter. T-letter 1EBFT, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, is the most important holiday on the Vietnamese calendar, a time of family reunion, ancestor veneration, and traditionally, a brief and almost sacred pause in hostilities, observed by both sides throughout years of fighting. In 1968, North Vietnamese and National Liberation Front commanders deliberately used the expectation of that pause as cover for the single largest and most coordinated military operation of the entire war. In the earliest hours of the 30th and 31st of January, while South Vietnamese soldiers were on leave to celebrate with their families, and American Commander's Guard was, in many places, deliberately lowered. Roughly 80,000 North Vietnamese and NLF troops launched simultaneous, coordinated assaults on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including provincial capitals, military bases, and even Saigon itself. In Saigon, a small commando team blasted its way onto the grounds of the United States Embassy, one of the most heavily fortified American installations in the country, and held part of the compound for several hours before being killed or captured, a psychological shock of enormous proportion, broadcast on American television, showing that even the supposed heart of American power in Vietnam was not safe. In the old imperial capital of HU-1EBF, Communist forces seized control of most of the city and held it for nearly a month, the longest and bloodiest urban battle of the entire war, fought street by street, building by building, with American and South Vietnamese forces eventually retaking the city only after weeks of brutal combat that left much of its historic center in ruins. During their occupation of HU-1EBF, Communist forces also carried out a systematic execution of thousands of people, identified as government officials, intellectuals, religious leaders, and other perceived enemies, their bodies later discovered in mass graves around the city, one of the darkest and most disputed episodes of the entire war. Militarily, the T-1EBFT offensive was, in almost every immediate sense, a catastrophic failure for the North. The uprising among the southern population that Hanoi had hoped for never materialized. Ordinary South Vietnamese did not rise up to join the attackers. American and South Vietnamese forces, though caught off guard, responded with overwhelming firepower, and within weeks had recaptured virtually every position the Communists had seized, inflicting devastating casualties, tens of thousands of NLF and North Vietnamese fighters killed, losses so severe that the National Liberation Front, as an effective independent fighting force, never fully recovered. With the war's later years increasingly carried by regular North Vietnamese army units rather than southern guerrillas. And yet, my friend, here is the strange, aching irony that sits at the very heart of this chapter. The T-1 EBFT offensive, a battlefield defeat for the Communists, became one of the most significant strategic victories of the entire war, because of what it did to American public opinion rather than what it did on the battlefield. For nearly 3 years, American officials, including General Westmoreland himself, had been telling the American public that the war was being won, that there was, in Westmoreland's own words from a visit to Washington just weeks earlier, light at the end of the tunnel. Then, suddenly, television screens showed an enemy capable of striking the American embassy in the supposedly secure capital of an ally, capable of holding a major city for weeks. The gap between official reassurance and the images Americans were watching every evening became, almost overnight, impossible to ignore or explain away. A respected and trusted television anchor, Walter Cronkite, traveled to Vietnam himself in the aftermath of T-1 EBFT, and upon returning, delivered a rare editorial opinion on the air, concluding that the war was, in his judgment, unwinnable, and that the only rational course was a negotiated withdrawal, not as loud protesters or campus radicals, but as America's most trusted news voice. President Johnson is said to have remarked that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. Public opinion polls in the weeks after T-1 EBFT showed support for the war dropping sharply and support for Johnson himself collapsing. In March 1968, badly weakened politically, having nearly lost the New Hampshire Democratic primary to an anti-war challenger, Johnson made a stunning televised announcement. He would seek to open peace negotiations with North Vietnam, and in the same address, he announced that he would not seek re-election as president. A man who had once seemed unbeatable, undone, in large part, by a war he had never fully wanted to escalate in the first place. Rest here a while, my friend, in the strange irony of T-1 EBFT, a battle won on the ground and lost in the living room, a president stepping down not on a battlefield but in front of a television camera. When we return, we will sit with 2 more terrible names from that same difficult year, the massacre at a hamlet called M-1 EF9 Lai, and the rising storm of protest back home in America, before turning finally to a new president determined to find, in his own words, peace with honor. Sleep now, my friend. We continue soon, chapter by chapter. Chapter 10. A hamlet called M-1 EF9 Lai and a home front in revolt. Hello again, my friend. Come back under the blanket and let's move gently, carefully, into one of the heaviest passages of this whole long story. On the 16th of March, 1968, just weeks after the T-1 EBFT offensive, a company of American soldiers entered a cluster of hamlets in Q-1EA3 NG Ngai province known collectively as M-1 EF9 Lai, expecting to find a Viet Cong stronghold. Instead, they found only civilians, mostly elderly men, women, and children, no armed enemy fighters at all. Over the following hours, soldiers under the command of Lieutenant William Calley killed several hundred unarmed Vietnamese villagers, many of them shot at close range in ditches and rice paddies, homes burned, livestock destroyed. It was, by any honest measure, a massacre, one of the darkest single episodes of American conduct in the entire war. The killing was stopped, remarkably, in part, by an American helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson, who, seeing what was unfolding from the air, landed his aircraft between fleeing villagers and advancing American soldiers, ordered his own machine gunner to train weapons on his fellow Americans if they continued firing, and personally airlifted a small number of survivors to safety, an act of extraordinary moral courage that went largely unrecognized for decades afterward. The massacre itself was covered up within the military chain of command for well over a year, until an investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh, working from information provided by a soldier named Ronald Ridenhour, who had heard accounts from participants and felt compelled to write letters to Congress and the Pentagon demanding an investigation, broke the story publicly in November 1969. Photographs taken by an Army photographer at the scene, showing piles of bodies in a ditch, were published around the world, and the impact on American public opinion was profound and immediate, undermining, for many Americans, any remaining sense that the war was being fought honorably, or that American forces were simply the good guys in a straightforward moral story. Only Lieutenant Calley was ultimately convicted for the massacre, sentenced initially to life in prison, though his sentence was repeatedly reduced, and he served only a few years, mostly under house arrest, a legal outcome that struck many observers, then and since, as a profound failure of justice given the scale of what had occurred. Meanwhile, my friend, back in the United States, opposition to the war had been building for years, but it now surged into something far larger and more mainstream. What had started in the mid-1960s mostly among college students, religious pacifists, and civil rights activists, including a memorable and controversial speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1967, explicitly connecting the war to issues of racial and economic justice at home, calling the United States government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, grew by the later years of the decade into a mass movement spanning a remarkable cross-section of American society. Massive demonstrations, including a 1969 moratorium to end the war that drew hundreds of thousands of participants in Washington and other cities, filled the streets. Draft resistance became widespread, with young men burning draft cards, fleeing to Canada, or seeking conscientious objector status in numbers that strained the selective service system. Popular music of the era, songs of protest and weariness, became inseparable from the broader cultural mood of the time, a soundtrack to a generation's disillusionment. The movement was not without its own internal tensions and its own tragedies. In May 1970, following President Nixon's announcement of an expansion of the war into Cambodia, which we will look at more closely soon, student protests erupted on campuses across the country. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops, called in to control a protest, opened fire on a crowd of students, killing 4 and wounding 9, several of whom had not even been participating in the demonstration but were simply walking to class. Photographs from that day, particularly one showing a young woman kneeling in anguish over a fallen student, became instantly iconic. Another burned an image joining the burning monk and the ditch at M1EF9 lie in the gallery of pictures that defined how an entire generation remembered this war. 10 days later, a similar shooting at Jackson State College in Mississippi, a historically black institution, killed 2 more students, though it received considerably less national attention at the time, a disparity many have since noted reflected the racial inequities running throughout how the war and its opposition were covered and remembered. Veterans themselves became an increasingly visible and powerful part of the anti-war movement, an organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War giving testimony about atrocities and everyday brutalities they said were far more widespread than official accounts admitted. And in a particularly striking moment in 1971, a young veteran named John Kerry, who would decades later become a senator and secretary of state, testified before Congress asking how you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake, a question that captured, perhaps as well as any single sentence could, the exhausted, disillusioned mood gripping so much of the country by that point in the war. Rest here a while, my friend, with the weight of this chapter, the ditch, the helicopter pilot's brave interference, the crowds in the streets, the kneeling girl at Kent State. It is a heavy chapter, I know, heavier than most of what has come before, and heavier than some of what will still come after, but it belongs here, honestly told, because sleepy stories are still true stories, and true stories sometimes carry weight even as they lull us toward rest. When we return, we will meet the new president who inherited this exhausted, divided country, and watch him try to find a way out of a war he could not simply abandon and could not fully win. Sleep now, my friend. We continue soon, chapter by chapter. Chapter 11, Peace with Honor in a Wider World. Hello again, my friend. Settle back in and let's meet the man who took over this long, exhausting war from Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, elected in November 1968 partly on a promise, never fully specified at the time, that he had a plan to end the war and win, as he put it, peace with honor. Nixon's approach, developed with his national security advisor Henry Kissinger, rested on a strategy that came to be called Vietnamization, gradually shifting the burden of ground combat onto South Vietnamese forces, while steadily withdrawing American troops, all while continuing to supply Saigon with weapons, training, and air power. It was, in some sense, an attempt to have it both ways, to reduce the American presence that had become so politically toxic at home, without simply abandoning South Vietnam to defeat. American troop levels, which had peaked at over 500,000, began falling steadily from 1969 onward. But even as American ground troops slowly came home, Nixon and Kissinger pursued an escalation of a different kind, widening the war rather than narrowing it. In 1969, Nixon secretly authorized an intensive bombing campaign against communist sanctuaries and supply lines inside neutral Cambodia, a campaign kept hidden from the American public and even from much of Congress for over a year. Then, in April 1970, Nixon publicly announced a ground invasion of Cambodia by American and South Vietnamese forces, intended to disrupt those same sanctuaries, an announcement that triggered the wave of campus protests we already sat with together, including the shootings at Kent State and Jackson State. The following year, in 1971, South Vietnamese forces, with American air and artillery support but no American ground troops, launched a similar incursion into Laos, aimed at cutting the H-Letter 183 Chi Minh Trail, an operation that ended in a costly and demoralizing retreat under heavy North Vietnamese counterattack, raising serious doubts about how well Vietnamization was actually working once American forces stepped back from the front lines. The expansion of the war into Cambodia carried consequences far beyond the battlefield, my friend. Consequences that would unfold with terrible clarity in the years just ahead. The chaos and devastation of American bombing, combined with the destabilization of Cambodia's own government, helped a small, previously marginal communist movement called the Khmer Rouge grow rapidly in strength and recruitment throughout the countryside. We will need to return to Cambodia later in this story, because what grew from those seeds became one of the great horrors of the 20th century. But we will let that thread rest for now, coiled quietly in the background, the way a shadow lengthens before you quite notice the sun has moved. Diplomatically, secret negotiations between Kissinger and the North Vietnamese Politburo member, Lair D-Letter 1E9C Th-Letter 1ECD, had been underway in Paris since 1968, running in parallel with public, largely theatrical peace talks that included representatives of the Saigon government and the National Liberation Front as well. Progress was slow and repeatedly interrupted by continued fighting, including a massive North Vietnamese conventional invasion of the South in the spring of 1972, called the Easter Offensive, which was eventually beaten back with the help of intense American bombing, demonstrating both that North Vietnam could still mount major conventional operations and that South Vietnamese forces, with sufficient American air support, could still hold their ground when directly attacked. By late 1972, with a peace agreement seemingly close, but negotiations again stalling, Nixon ordered an intense campaign of bombing against Hanoi and Haiphong in December 1972, a campaign that came to be called the Christmas Bombing, intended to pressure North Vietnam back to the negotiating table and reassure a nervous South Vietnamese government that the United States would not simply abandon it. The bombing was controversial, criticized around the world for its intensity and the civilian casualties it caused, though it did coincide with a return to serious negotiations. On the 27th of January 1973, representatives of the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the National Liberation Front signed the Paris Peace Accords, formally ending direct American military involvement in the war. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all remaining American troops within 60 days, the return of American prisoners of war, and notably, allowed North Vietnamese troops already present in the South to remain in place, a provision South Vietnamese President Nguyen Letter 1EC5 and Van Thi Letter 1EC7 deeply distrusted, believing, correctly as it turned out, that it left his country dangerously exposed once American support fully withdrew. Rest here for a moment, my friend, with this uneasy peace. American soldiers finally boarding planes home, American prisoners of war, some held for years in brutal conditions in places like the prison Americans, grimly nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton, finally reunited with their families. And quietly in the background, North Vietnamese divisions still positioned deep inside the South, waiting. When we return, we will watch just how briefly that peace actually lasted and how the story of South Vietnam came, with startling speed, to its final and most heartbreaking chapter. Sleep now, my friend. We continue soon, chapter by chapter. Chapter 12, The Fall of Saigon. Hello again, my friend. Pull the blanket up a little higher for this one. We are coming now to the end of the war itself, and it arrives faster than almost anyone expected. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were, in practice, more a pause than a true peace. Fighting between North and South Vietnamese forces continued almost without interruption in the 2 years that followed, each side probing and testing the other's resolve, even as American combat troops were gone entirely by the spring of 1973. Watergate, the political scandal that would eventually force Richard Nixon's resignation in August 1974, consumed American political attention and badly weakened the presidency at precisely the moment South Vietnam most needed steady American support. Congress, reflecting a war-weary and increasingly skeptical American public, cut military aid to South Vietnam sharply in 1974, a decision that left the South Vietnamese army desperately short of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts for American-supplied equipment it had grown entirely dependent upon. In Hanoi, North Vietnamese leaders watched this unraveling of American commitment carefully, and by late 1974 concluded that the political climate in Washington made any renewed American military intervention extremely unlikely, no matter what happened in the South. In early 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a limited offensive in the Central Highlands, testing South Vietnamese resolve, and when South Vietnamese President Thi Letter 1EC7 made the fateful decision to order a strategic withdrawal from the highlands, hoping to consolidate his forces to defend more populated coastal areas, that withdrawal collapsed into chaos and panic. Columns of retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians clogging narrow mountain roads that North Vietnamese artillery and advancing units tore into mercilessly. What was meant to be an orderly repositioning turned, almost overnight, into a rout. Sensing an opportunity far larger than they had originally planned for that year, North Vietnamese commanders accelerated their timeline dramatically. City after city fell with startling speed through March and early April of 1975. HU Letter 1E BF, Da Nang, entire South Vietnamese divisions disintegrating, soldiers abandoning weapons and uniforms, terrified civilians flooding south in scenes of mass panic, boats overloaded at ports, roads jammed for miles with refugees on foot, bicycle, and cart. The speed of the collapse startled even North Vietnamese leadership, who found themselves racing to keep pace with a victory unfolding faster than their own plans had anticipated. By mid-April, North Vietnamese forces were closing in on Saigon itself. American officials, including Ambassador Graham Martin, delayed evacuation planning for weeks, worried that visible preparations for withdrawal would trigger panic and collapse South Vietnamese morale even faster, a decision that left far too little time when the final crisis actually arrived. On the 29th of April, 1975, with North Vietnamese artillery already shelling Saigon's airport, American radio stations began playing a coded signal disc jockey armed forces radio, announcing that the temperature in Saigon was 105 degrees and rising, followed by the song White Christmas, the prearranged cue for American personnel and their Vietnamese allies to begin final evacuation to designated pickup points. What followed became one of the most searing images of the entire war. Operation Frequent Wind, a frantic helicopter evacuation from the American embassy, compound, and other points across the city, carrying American staff and as many South Vietnamese allies, employees, and their families as could be crammed aboard. Helicopters landing on rooftops, on the embassy's own rooftop, ferrying passengers out to naval vessels waiting offshore. Some helicopters, once their passengers were unloaded, simply pushed overboard into the sea to make room on crowded ship decks for the next arrival. Crowds of desperate South Vietnamese, many of whom had worked closely with Americans throughout the war and feared, with good reason, retribution under a communist government, surged against the embassy gates and walls, and countless people who had been promised evacuation were, in the chaos and compressed timeline, left behind. On the morning of the 30th of April, 1975, a North Vietnamese tank crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon, the seat of South Vietnamese government. South Vietnam's final president, General Duong Van Minh, who had taken office only 2 days earlier specifically to negotiate a surrender, broadcast an announcement of unconditional surrender over the radio. The Vietnam War, in every meaningful military sense, was over, 21 years after the Geneva Accords had first split the country, and 30 years after H. Letter 1ED3 Chi Minh had stood in Ba Dinh Square and read a borrowed Declaration of Independence to a hopeful crowd. Saigon itself would soon be renamed H. Letter 1ED3 Chi Minh City, in honor of a leader who had died in 1969, 6 years before finally seeing, even if only from beyond his own life, the reunification he had spent his whole life pursuing. Rest here for a moment, my friend, with that tank crashing through those palace gates, with the helicopters pushed into the sea, with the crowds left behind at the embassy walls. It is one of the most vivid endings in modern history, and also in its own way a beginning, the beginning of a reunified Vietnam trying to find its footing after 30 continuous years of war. When we return, we will follow the refugees fleeing by boat across dangerous seas, sit for a while with the re-education camps and the hard early years of a unified but exhausted country, and finally trace the long, slow path toward the peace and reconciliation that, eventually, even old enemies would come to share. Sleep now, my friend. We continue soon, chapter by chapter. Chapter 13, What the Peace Cost. Hello again, my friend. Come back close, because this next chapter is quiet and sad in a different way than the battles were, the long, grinding sadness of what comes after a war rather than the sharp shock of the war itself. Reunification did not bring an easy peace to Vietnam. The new communist government, governing a country now unified for the first time since the 17th parallel had split it apart in 1954, moved quickly to consolidate control over the South. And for hundreds of thousands of people who had served in the South Vietnamese military or government, or who had worked closely with Americans during the war, this meant being sent to what the government called re-education camps. Promised these camps would involve only brief political instruction lasting a matter of weeks, many detainees instead found themselves held for years, some for well over a decade, in harsh conditions involving forced labor, malnutrition, and political indoctrination, in remote camps scattered across the country. Precise numbers remain disputed, but historians estimate that somewhere between several 100,000 and 1 million South Vietnamese passed through this system in the years after 1975. Economically, the newly unified Vietnam struggled badly in its first decade, as the government attempted to impose Soviet-style central planning and agricultural collectivization onto a country, and a southern region especially, accustomed to very different economic patterns, all while absorbing the staggering physical devastation the war itself had left behind: cratered landscapes, unexploded ordnance still killing and maiming civilians decades later, contaminated soil from Agent Orange, and a currency and banking system in disarray, combined with continued discrimination against families associated with the former Southern government, and for many ethnic Chinese Vietnamese. A wave of persecution connected to worsening relations with China in the late 1970s. These pressures drove an extraordinary wave of immigration. Beginning in the mid-1970s and continuing through the 1980s, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people, and refugees would eventually number well over 1 million, fled the country by sea in small, often dangerously overcrowded and unseaworthy boats, hopping to reach refugee camps in neighboring countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and eventually resettlement further afield in the United States, Australia, France, and elsewhere. The world came to call them, with a mixture of sympathy and helplessness, the boat people. Their journeys were often horrific: storms, starvation, and, tragically common, attacks by pirates in the waters of the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand, who robbed, assaulted, and sometimes killed refugees adrift at sea. Estimates of how many died attempting these crossings vary enormously, from tens of thousands to several 100,000, an almost unbearable postscript to a war that was supposed to have already ended. And yet, out of this tragedy, entire new Vietnamese diaspora communities took root around the world, in cities like Little Saigon in Southern California, in Houston, in Sydney, in Paris, communities that would, over the following decades, rebuild lives, raise children born into new countries, and carry Vietnamese language, food, and memory forward into places H-1ED3 Chi Minh himself, in his younger traveling years, might almost have recognized from his own long exile abroad. Meanwhile, that shadow we set aside earlier in Cambodia grew into something almost too dark to hold gently even in a sleepy story, though it belongs here honestly because it grew directly out of the same war. The Khmer Rouge, the communist movement that had gained strength amid the chaos of American bombing and civil war in Cambodia during the early 1970s, seized full power in April 1975, just days before Saigon itself fell, and under its leader Pol Pot, attempted an almost unimaginably radical transformation of Cambodian society, evacuating entire cities at gunpoint, abolishing money, private property, and religion, and forcing the population into agricultural labor camps. Between 1975 and 1979, through execution, starvation, disease, and exhaustion under forced labor, the Khmer Rouge killed an estimated 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians, roughly a quarter of the country's entire population, one of the most concentrated episodes of mass killing in modern history. It was, finally, Vietnam itself that ended this horror, invading Cambodia in December 1978 and toppling the Khmer Rouge government within weeks. A striking irony, one communist government overthrowing another, though Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia that followed would drag on for a full decade, straining Vietnam's already exhausted economy and further isolating it internationally. China, allied with the deposed Khmer Rouge and increasingly at odds with a Soviet-aligned Vietnam, launched a brief but bloody punitive invasion of northern Vietnam in February 1979, a conflict lasting only about a month but costing tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. A strange and little-remembered coda in which two communist neighbors, so recently allies against the United States, turned their weapons on each other instead. Rest here a while, my friend, even though this chapter has been a heavy one to carry into sleep. The re-education camps, the boats on the open sea, the shadow that grew into Cambodia's darkest years, the brief war between former communist allies. These things happened, and honest history holds space for them alongside the hope that came before and the healing that slowly came after. When we return, we will finally watch old enemies begin, tentatively and imperfectly, to become something more like friends, and we will close this very long story together, gently, the way any long story should end. Sleep now, my friend. We continue soon, chapter by chapter. Chapter 14. Old enemies slowly becoming something else. Hello again, my friend. We are near the end now, so let your breathing slow all the way down, and let's watch time do what time so often does, soften even the hardest history. For nearly 2 decades after 1975, the United States and Vietnam remained formally, without diplomatic relations at all, the wound too fresh, the politics too fraught on both sides. The United States maintained a trade embargo against Vietnam for many years, and Vietnam, isolated internationally because of its occupation of Cambodia and its alliance with the Soviet Union, struggled economically through the 1980s. A turning point came in 1986, when Vietnam's Communist Party, watching similar reforms unfold elsewhere in the communist world, launched a policy called D-stroke letter 1ED5 IM letter 1EDBI, meaning renovation, gradually opening the economy to market mechanisms and foreign investment while maintaining single-party political control, a path that would, over the following decades, transform Vietnam from one of the poorest countries in the world into a rapidly growing manufacturing and export economy. On the American side, the fate of service members still listed as missing in action remained a powerful and emotional obstacle to any normalization of relations for years, with veterans' families and organizations pressing for a full accounting of the missing before any reconciliation could proceed. Slow, careful cooperation on this issue through the late 1980s and early 1990s, including joint American-Vietnamese teams searching crash sites and burial locations, gradually built enough trust for larger diplomatic steps. In 1994, President Bill Clinton lifted the trade embargo, and in July 1995, exactly 2 decades after the fall of Saigon, the United States and Vietnam formally normalized diplomatic relations. It fell to a Vietnam veteran himself, Senator John Kerry, whose earlier testimony asking how you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake we heard back in an earlier chapter, along with fellow veteran and former prisoner of war Senator John McCain, to help lead this bipartisan effort toward reconciliation. 2 men who had fought on opposite ends of the same terrible war working together, decades later, to help their 2 countries move forward. In the years since, the relationship between the United States and Vietnam has grown into something that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the young Marines wadding ashore at Da Nang in 1965, or the young soldiers of the National Liberation Front moving supplies down the H-1ED3 Chi Minh Trail. American presidents from both parties have visited Hanoi and H-1ED3 Chi Minh City. Trade between the two countries has grown enormously. American and Vietnamese veterans have returned together to former battlefields, sometimes even meeting former adversaries face to face, finding, more often than either side expected, a shared and weary humanity underneath old uniforms. Vietnam today, a country of roughly 100 million people, is one where the majority of the population was born well after the war ended. A young country in demographic terms, carrying an old and heavy history lightly, the way any resilient people eventually learn to do. And yet, my friend, the war's costs were never fully settled, and never will be entirely. Estimates of total deaths across the whole conflict, spanning the First and Second Indochina Wars together, range widely, but a commonly cited figure suggests as many as 2 to 3 million Vietnamese deaths, military and civilian combined, alongside roughly 200,000 to 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, over 1 million North Vietnamese and NLF fighters, and just over 58,000 American service members, their names etched today into a long, black granite wall in Washington, D.C., a memorial whose quiet, reflective design, allowing visitors to see their own faces mirrored among the names, was itself controversial when first proposed by a young architecture student named Maya Lin, and has since become one of the most visited and most emotionally powerful memorials in the world. Add to all of this the ongoing legacy of unexploded ordnance still injuring people in the Vietnamese countryside decades later, and the multi-generational health effects of Agent Orange exposure still being studied and slowly, still being addressed, and you begin to understand, my friend, that wars do not really end on the day a peace agreement is signed or a tank crashes through a palace gate. They linger quietly in soil, in bodies, in memory, for generations afterward. Rest here now, my friend, in this long, slow softening, in old soldiers shaking hands on former battlefields, in a black granite wall reflecting quiet faces, in a young country carrying old scars forward into a very different future. We have one more short chapter left together, just a gentle closing before I let you drift all the way off. Sleep now if you haven't already. We'll finish, gently, very soon. Chapter 15, a long story gently closed. Hello again, my friend, one more time. This is the last chapter, so let yourself go completely soft now, however you're sitting or lying, and let's just look back together quietly at how far we've traveled tonight. We began beside 2 great rivers, with a dragon lord and a mountain fairy and their 100 children, a gentle legend explaining a people pulled always between water and mountain, between north and south. We watched 1,000 years pass under Chinese rule, and watched, again and again, small uprisings insist that Vietnam remain itself. We watched French ships arrive, and colonial rule settle over the land like humid air before a storm. We met a quiet, patient traveler who carried the word patriot in one of his many names, and watched him read borrowed words from an American declaration to a hopeful crowd on one bright September afternoon. We watched hope collide with the ambitions of empire, watched a war of stakes hidden in a river become a war of artillery, hidden in mountains overlooking a valley called D-I-1EC7 in Bierne PH-1E7. We watched a line drawn temporarily at the 17th parallel harden into something else entirely, watched a monk sit in perfect stillness while flames rose around him, watched 2 leaders die within 3 weeks of each other on opposite sides of the world, watched flowers draped over the necks of young Marines on a beach that would soon become so much less gentle. We sat inside the long, exhausting texture of the war itself, the helicopters, the tunnels, the short timer calendars, the families caught between 2 armies in their own rice paddies. We watched a Lunar New Year offensive fail on the battlefield and succeed unexpectedly in America's living rooms. We carried the heavy weight of a hamlet called M1EF9 Lie and watched a home front rise in protest, some of it joyful, some of it, at Kent State and Jackson State, unbearably sad. We watched a president promise peace with honor while quietly widening the war into 2 more countries, watched a fragile peace signed in Paris, and watched, not so very much later, a tank crash through a palace gate and helicopters pushed into the sea. We sat with what the peace cost, the re-education camps, the boats on dangerous water, the shadow that grew into Cambodia's darkest years. And finally, gently, we watched old enemies, so slowly over so many years, learn to shake hands again. That is the whole long shape of it, my friend, or as much of it as one long night of stories can hold. Vietnam's story did not end in 1975, of course. It continues today, in a young, bustling country of motorbikes and rice paddies and gleaming new cities, carrying its history the way any of us carry our own, not as a burden alone, but as the simple, undeniable fact of how we came to be exactly who we are. And your own story, my friend, continues too, past this quiet room, past this soft pillow into tomorrow. Thank you for staying with me through all of it, through the rivers and the dragons and the rice paddies and the palaces, through the ships and the trails and the long, difficult years, all the way to this gentle, closing quiet. There is nothing more you need to remember tonight. Just rest now. Sleep well, my friend. Good night.